Where exactly in South Africa were you born?
I was born in Dundee, which is a small town in Natal, about 4 hours southeast of Johannesburg.
And I wondered, you started studying the piano when you were 10, but then you already lived in Australia. So when did you move there?
I left South Africa as I was turning 9. The whole family emigrated for political and financial reasons as well, and we went to Australia. As you say, it was about 10 when I started the piano in Australia, in the fantastic music program of elementary schools there, which is really just wonderful in Australia. They make a point of allowing children in elementary school a lot of time for classical music, for theory and piano, orchestra study. It's really wonderful. I must say, a fantastic, fantastic elementary music program in Australia.
What was it like in South Africa?
Much different. When I was growing up there in the first few years of school, music was certainly a much more cursory activity. You really had to make a point of having lessons. It wasn't really encouraged in school. It was expensive. There were a lot of reasons why it didn't flourish, and why it's not flourishing so fantastically today as well, I think.
And when did you decide you would become a musician? Were you very young still? Were you a young little Mozart?
Not at all. Actually, the first few years of piano study for me were really incredibly frustrating. I had major problems with reading and sight reading, obviously. Things changed to a large extent when I started playing the flute at about 13, and my reading was getting better, and I think that was a major hurdle for me to get over. But once I did, it became clear that the act of actually playing was as enjoyable as listening as well. I had always listened a lot, but could never really get over the technical and physical hurdles. So
how come you didn't become a flautist?
I think eventually, for me, it was just a question of repertoire. I mean, there's just so much unbelievable repertoire for keyboard instruments. And when you add into the mix harpsichord and virginal and organ and all that, you have just, years and years of music to devote yourself to. The flute is a great instrument and a wonderful color in an orchestral setting, but I found the repertoire more and more limiting as I went on, in a sense.
You mentioned the harpsichord. You both play the fortepiano, the normal piano, and the harpsichord. Would you say for each instrument it makes a difference? You have to have a different attitude or different technique?
Absolutely. It's one of the most exciting and challenging things that I've been exposed to. When I started playing harpsichord and fortepiano in my first years of university, it was sort of a great experimental experience, and I was trying out a lot of things, and it didn't have a lot of pressure attached to it. Now, obviously, because the bulk of my work is on harpsichord or fortepiano, it's very interesting to come back to these modern piano concerts and see how that influences you and how it changes your approach to touch and articulation and timing and all those things. And also, number one, how physically demanding it is compared to those instruments, which rely so much more upon, lightness and dexterity and ease than these modern pianos with their unbelievably heavy actions, and it's really a completely different world. But
I spoke to a pianist once who tried to make his Steinway sound like a fortepiano.
Uh-huh.
This seemed to me very silly. What do you think of that?
I think as a principle it's certainly silly to say I want to make my Steinway sound like a Graf or a Walter. But I do think that there is a spectrum of articulation and sound control which is very possible on modern pianos, which has a lot less to do with Rachmaninoff and Scriabin than it does with Mozart and Haydn. And although I think Steinways are certainly not, in my book, the dream instruments for Mozart and Haydn, they have a lot to offer. And if they're approached in the right way, they can offer an incredible lightness and airiness of sound.
On what instrument will you be playing the Mozart Concerto?
Well, tomorrow night it'll be a bona fide 9-foot Steinway, which is, as I said, very interesting. For the last 2 weeks I've been playing French Baroque literature on harpsichord, and coming back to the Steinway today really felt like lifting weights in a sense. It was just extraordinary to me. You get used to it very quickly, but it's really eye-opening to me how much pressure and weight it really does take to play these instruments. To a certain extent, these major key concertos of Mozart work very, very well on the Steinway. It's a very different type of experience than on original instruments with original orchestra as well, but it has a lot to offer, and it's very enjoyable for me as well.
Mozart wrote this piano concerto number 23 in 1786. What kind of instrument would he have had at the time?
It's a very good question. In essence, you're looking at a very typical and representative fortepiano from the late 18th century in Vienna. It's an instrument designed almost exclusively and constructed from wood. The hammers are much lighter. They're covered in leather. The dampers are made of leather, of course. The instrument is straight strung, not cross strung like the modern piano. The whole sound is more delicate, ambient. You can really explore the softer side of the dynamic level on these instruments. And I think ultimately they have an incredible delicacy and transparency, which is so perfect for late 18th century repertoire. They, for me, speak the rhetorically mercurial language of this style so much better than the Steinway. Differently, but certainly have a huge amount to offer.